I'm Indy Neidell, and this is a World War II special episode about the Char B tank in association with the Tank Museum Bovington.
The Char B tank is a tank that in the early spring of 1940 was considered by many to be the most powerful, probably the best tank in the world. And yet by the summer of 1940, abandoned or knocked out Char B tanks seemed to symbolise that French defeat at the hands of the Germans. Now, why is that? And how did the Char Bs come into service with the French military? And how did they think they were going to use the Char B? Now, at the end of the First World War, the French felt they knew the reasons for their victory. And that was the powerful use of artillery, the structured and organised use of infantry on the attack, and of course the addition of the new tanks, tanks like the FT tank. Now that combination led them to think that the organised, or as they described it, the methodical battle was the way forward. In many ways it was a very traditional use of an armed force, but they had done it on a scale and with a level of professionalism in 1918 that they thought that was the key to their victory. And a number of factors, including their success in the First World War, influence heavily how they are going to use tanks in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, the French military has a number of pressures on it. In 1920, it has got about 600,000 men in service, but the French government are now hoping that that number will massively reduce because the French military, it's a conscript army. It has a small professional cadre of soldiers who do the training, but the vast majority of the men that are serving are actual conscripts. Now, just before World War I, military service in France was for 3 years. The French government are hoping to cut that. And in the 1920s, a series of debates take place and legislation changes so that by 1930, French military service is now only 1 year. And that really means this professional part of the French army has only got about 6 months to train the soldiers, 6 months service, and then they go into the reserves. And there's another problem the French have. If you've got a massive reserve force, how do you keep them up to speed and keep them trained? And part of the answer the French come up with is keep the tactics simple, structured, and don't change them unless you absolutely have to. And that's another major reason why the French use tanks and think about their tanks and their military in the way they do in the 20s and 30s. It is not just about what the military wants to do, it is political considerations onto the French army. Now, the French military hierarchy also realised that the government, especially left-wing governments in France, are very nervous of the military. And they keep the military under tight control. Now, part of that, how they do that, part of that is this citizen army. The other thing is the French military are very aware that the government will not allow them to do things that doesn't fit in with their view of what the army should be. So, for example, in the early 1930s, when de Gaulle argues that they should have a very professional and well-organised armoured force that's almost independent along the lines of a Panzer division, the French military high command realised that politicians just would not allow that to happen. So it is scuppered very early on in the debate because, again, if you're a left-wing French government, you might see that armoured force of professional soldiers as a sort of Praetorian Guard, a cadre of troops that might one day even do something like a coup d'etat against the government. So it wasn't going to happen. Now, other factors that come into play. In 1930, when they've gone down to this 1 year military service, this idea of thinking through what would happen if a war comes, we're going to need to defend against Germany, hence the Maginot Line. And that Maginot Line almost makes concrete, literally makes concrete, this idea about how the French are going to have a defensive mentality to give them time to build up their reserves and go to another issue that the French had realised from World War I, which is a war footing. In other words, the whole country has to gear up for that idea of a total war. And that means defence industries. There's debates in the 20s and 30s about whether they should take private property into government ownership in the time of war, all sorts of things going on. But the idea they're going to need a bit of time to actually get their forces together and mobilise the whole country, and of course as well with the idea of alliances, get their alliances in place. So that defensive mentality with the Maginot Line, they realise that they have an open flank. And this again, they're not stupid to the idea that, hang on, there's going to be a problem there with an open flank. So they create, in 1930, they start the eye going. 1933, the first of what they call a DLM division comes into service. The idea being that the French military will move into Belgium if the Germans repeat their First World War offensive and come through Belgium. That French military force will need screening or protecting as it manoeuvres into position. Now, traditionally, that was the role of the horse cavalry. But in 1930, they start this process going that creates the first of these mobile divisions, a DLM division. And that is given wheels, it's given tracks, it's given a sense of mobility that's new in the French army. And again, that mobility will speed it with enough firepower and new R-35 tanks, a sort of medium weight light tank, that will go forward into Belgium, screen the rest of the French army that's manoeuvring. So they've seen the problem. They are not afraid of changing some of their tactics. But then again, this is done for a specific problem in mind. Later, in the mid-1930s, they look at the issue. They see the Germans are putting together these Panzer divisions, and again, they react to that by looking at what they have available. Now, the French have been absolutely adamant that the tank is part of the support mechanism for the infantry. They are going to help the infantry attack a position and back just after or the beginning of the First World War when they're designing. They've got the FT tank. They've still got 3,500 of those kicking around just after the war. They've also been designing this massive, great Char 2C breakthrough tank. That program continues. Only a few of them made. They seem to be mainly used for almost what you might call propaganda exercises, less to do with actual fighting. Estienne, the guy who's been promoting the tank in France in the First World War, he's made inspector of tanks in the 20s. And he goes ahead and actually starts building or organising the design of a tank that really the French military haven't actually asked for. He sees its potential as a breakthrough and exploitation weapon. The French see it just, the military serving, mainly see it just as a support vehicle for the infantry to advance, and then other methods will go forward to exploit a breakthrough. By 1935, the French High Command are realising that if the Germans with their Panzer divisions break through anywhere, they are going to have trouble because the traditional way of pulling anti-tank guns with horsed artillery may not be able to keep up or get to where that German advances in time. So they start looking at the idea of building infantry armoured divisions to support in a not just an attacking but a defensive role as well. And that's where we end up getting these DCR divisions, which are heavier armoured, and Estienne has got what becomes the Char B as a tank that is offering for that role. Now, they realise, and originally the Char B is being designed as the breakthrough, the punching through the front line tank. Actually, by adding the standard turret that's being used on a number of other French tanks with an anti-tank gun on it, if you add that to the Char B, then suddenly you've got a vehicle that can actually take on enemy tanks that might have broken through. Now, that sounds fine in theory. Unfortunately for the French, though, that when they enact this and they start building the Char B tank, they've still got this reservation about the tank being used for something other than supporting the infantry. So they don't create independent tank units in the way that they can advance, they can be supplied, they have their own artillery, etc. in the same manner. They are still, with these infantry tank divisions, still being forced to use support arms from all around the rest of the army. Now, this whole thought process that the French military are going through, in other words, making sure that you are very structured, organised, We don't want people going off with their own bright ideas. In fact, they don't encourage debate in France in the 1930s. De Gaulle's almost an exception. Etienne is in many areas and many ways he's actually kept to one side with his theories as well. They want to keep that formal structure in place of the organised, methodical battle, support to the infantry, looking at the longer term game in how they're going to fight that battle, mobilising their forces and using that Maginot Line as part of the method to give France time to gear up again to fight a successful war. And they're believing those theories are what they learnt in World War I. Of course, if you think of it, those theories are almost a complete opposite to the theories that are influencing those panzer divisions that are coming the other way in the summer of 1940s. The idea of exploitation, of speed, get inside the opposition's decision-making circle, act quickly, don't wait, don't hang around for a structured set of commands coming down, exploit any situation going there, keep your armour independent and fully mobile. All of that is what the military of Germany throws at France in May of 1940, and as we all know, the French theory, however well thought it was, fails. And lots of these Char B tanks and very brave crew members who were serving them seem to be let down as they're led from pillar to post, trying to stop a German invasion which is just going at a pace that they just were not prepared for.
Well, that is it for today, but if you'd like to see another tank special we did, you can click right here for the Soviet T-26. And please, if you'd like to see more specials like this in the future, support us on Patreon. Every dollar does in fact count. You can do that at patreon.com or at timeghost.tv. See you next time.